Between 1942 and 1943, the Nazis carried out one of the most horrific campaigns of genocide ever perpetrated. The extermination of the Jews in occupied Poland was carried out at secret death camps. Sobibor, Treblinka, Belzec, Chełmno, their names forever synonymous with mass murder. At Treblinka alone, they could kill 12,000 Jews in one day.
Tutaj w tym miejscu zostały zakopane 875 000 trupów.
By the time the camps were closed in 1943, over 1.5 million Jews from all over Eastern Europe had been eliminated. Commandant Franz Stangl was in charge of both Sobibor and Treblinka extermination camps. He helped to perfect these killing machines. At the end of the war, he and one of his brutal subordinates went on the run, hiding out in South America. They would be pursued for 30 years by Simon Wiesenthal, himself a survivor of the Nazi concentration camps. He had dedicated his life to the memory of those who had perished around him. Wiesenthal was to become Stangel's nemesis, hunting him halfway around the world before finally getting his man. And he wanted Stangle alive, because a public trial would ensure Stangel's terrible crimes would not be forgotten.
Very big success was the commander of Treblinka, Stangle. It was the only trial, because all the others, they commit suicide from the extermination camps.
Schlagbäume und Grenzpfähle sind für alle Zeiten gefallen. Ein Volk hat zueinander gefunden.
Franz Stangel's path to evil began in May 1938, when Hitler's Nazis crossed the border into Austria to a tumultuous welcome. From now on, Hitler announced, Austria, a sovereign independent country, would be just part of a greater Germany. But beneath the welcome, there was fear. Anyone who could be labelled an enemy of the Reich was right to be afraid. Within months, 70,000 Austrians were rounded up and many executed. For 30-year-old Franz Stangl, this was a time of opportunity. He'd been brought up as a traditional Austrian Catholic with a strong belief in decency and family values. But he was also a man with ambition. He had already given up one promising career as a master weaver. Although strangely, these skills would later help him to survive. Instead, his passion for detail and discipline led him to join the Austrian police, and now he found himself answering to the country's new rulers. His political sympathies before the arrival of the Nazis are unclear, but after 1938, loyalty to the party was the price Stangle was prepared to pay for a new job. But what would it mean to follow the swastika? German propaganda tried to portray the Catholic family values of Austria and Nazi ideology going hand in hand. And in the case of Stangle, it seems to have worked. The good Catholic became a good Nazi. One of the Nazi ideals was the purity of the Aryan master race. It was a personal obsession of Adolf Hitler. In his warped vision of the Third Reich, there was no room for the weak or the imperfect. In 1939, he launched the so-called Euthanasia program. New mothers were expected to report birth defects and disabled children. They were to be weeded out and eliminated. Schloss Hartheim was one of Hitler's euthanasia centers. Anxious to please his new Nazi bosses, Franz Stangl accepted an administrative post here as head of police. This would be his first step into the most evil operations of the Nazi regime. Thousands of men, women, and children were secretly executed by injection or gassed. They called it mercy killing. And terrible though it was, there was an even more ghastly purpose to Schloss Hartheim. It was a school for mass murder. It was here they perfected gassing by engine exhaust fumes, a forerunner to the extermination camps. How could Stangle, a believer in the sanctity of life, allow himself to play even an administrative role in this slaughter? One possible answer comes from a colleague, Gustav Wagner, who worked in the crematorium.
Dass die Sache unangenehm ist, das hat ja jeder selbst empfunden. Nicht? Aber schließlich, wie gesagt, schon, es war nicht unsere Aufgabe, darüber nachzudenken. Denn das ist eine Sache der Ärzte gewesen.
There was a brief moment of relief in 1941 when Hitler temporarily stopped the euthanasia program. The last time he would be swayed by public opinion. But Stangel's Nazi minders now knew he was a man that they could use. They had already lined up a new role for him. The Nazi blitzkrieg, unleashed against Poland in 1939, had swept aside the ill-prepared Polish army. But it brought an unexpected problem. What to do with the hundreds of thousands of Eastern European Jews now under the direct control of Hitler's regime? Initially, the Nazis adopted a two-pronged approach. A ruthless policy of segregation, herding the Jews into crowded ghettos in many of the major Polish cities. At the same time, Hitler sent in his Einsatzgruppen, or special action groups, with orders to slaughter all civilian opponents of the Reich, which in his view included thousands of Jews. But these mass executions were not efficient. They were proving costly both in resources and in the psychological impact on the men responsible. A more deadly, more radical scheme was soon on the agenda. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, devised a final solution to the Jewish question. Genocide, to be carried out in secret extermination camps hidden away in remote parts of Poland. To run the operation, Himmler brought in men from the euthanasia program, including Franz Stangl and Gustav Wagner. In early 1942, Stangle was sent as Commandant to what would become Sobibor camp in eastern Poland. He would later claim he thought he'd been sent there to construct an army supply camp. But the grim reality was, the Nazis were building a gas chamber in the forest. The lethal technique using exhaust fumes perfected in the Euthanasia program was now to be used in the industrial mass murder of Jews. The whole process from ghetto to gas chamber involved a succession of cruel deceptions. It began with Germans collecting money from Jews in the ghetto to convince them that this was a journey worth taking. In their thousands, men, women, and children were rounded up. At worst, the Jews thought they were going to labor camps. But they were forced into railway wagons, often traveling for days without food and water. When they arrived at Sobibor, Stangle had laid out a deadly illusion. His men told the new arrivals they were at a transit camp. They needed to get undressed and take showers to prevent disease. The bewildered, starving, and exhausted Jews stripped naked and were told to set aside all their clothes and possessions. The women then had their heads shaved. Human hair was a valuable commodity for the Nazis. Then the victims, now minutes from death, were forced down a narrow barbed wire path called the tube, leading not to the showers, but to the gas chambers. Their bodies were then thrown into mass graves and later incinerated. From arrival to death could take as little as an hour. In the 3 months that Stangle was in command at Sobibor, about 100,000 Jews were killed in this way. Those who did it coped by denying responsibility. Gustav Wagner, Stangle's fellow veteran of the Euthanasia program, was now his deputy at Sobibor.
Das ist, weil ihm der Befehl da war, nicht? Aber gedacht habe ich mir da gar nichts dabei. Auch die anderen nicht.
Commandant Stangle's way of dealing with this moral nightmare was to make the whole process run like clockwork. Survivors remember his passionate attention to detail. He was always dressed immaculately in a white linen jacket. His boots polished like mirrors, every detail perfect, as if in denial of the carnage around him. But at night, he sought refuge in drink, either alone or at parties with his SS colleagues. His superiors, including Himmler himself, the architect of the final solution, saw only the efficiency of Stangle's killing machine. He would soon have an even more terrible job for his camp commandant. While Stangle was impressing the Nazi hierarchy, the man who would make him pay for his crimes was going through his own personal hell. In 1941, Simon Wiesenthal and his wife Silla were living in the city of Lvov in modern-day Ukraine when it was overrun by the German army. Wiesenthal and his wife were both sent to a concentration camp. It was the start of a Holocaust nightmare that would see 89 members of their extended family die.
My mother was taken August 23, 1942, and the whole train with all these people, this was the elderly people, they were not working, they were taking them, and the direction was Belzec, this was the extermination camp. These 3 days that the wagons of the train was waiting in August without water, we hear it, and could not help. This was, for me, a terrible time. When I was thinking about this, I had only one hope. My mother, she was ill, and they heard that she had died before they was coming to the extermination camp.
In the middle of this horror, Wiesenthal tried to get his wife to safety, but he would later be told that she too had been killed. Meanwhile, in late summer 1942, across Poland, the extermination of the Jews was moving into its industrial phase. Those in the Warsaw Ghetto were being rounded up and sent to an extermination camp near the village of Treblinka. But the camp was an embarrassment to the German hierarchy. It was in chaos, its staff overwhelmed by the sheer numbers. Hundreds of tons of stolen Jewish money, jewelry, clothes, and possessions were piling up. The Nazis needed someone to establish order, and they had the perfect man for the job. Commandant Stangle had been so efficient at Sobibor extermination camp, he was now sent to sort out Treblinka. He later described what he found as Dante's Inferno. These photographs, taken by a young Austrian soldier at a railway station near the camp, give just a glimpse of the full horror awaiting Stangle. Bodies of Jews lay along the tracks leading to Treblinka. Stangle thought this was a disgrace. He was determined to turn Treblinka into a highly efficient killing operation. He created a fake railway station, even commissioning a painted clock, its hands permanently fixed, to deceive the Jews arriving at what they thought was a transit camp. German and Ukrainian guards led them to barracks where they were forced to undress in preparation for a shower. The women's heads were shaved. From there, a barbed wire path of death, cynically known by the Nazis as the Road to Heaven, led to the building containing the gas chambers. Polish Jew Samuel Willenberg was one of the few to survive.
I tutaj Niemcy zaczęli krzyczeć sznel, sznel, sznel i on zaczyna lecieć wzdłuż tego baraku w kierunku do ścieżki śmierci i nie wiedząc dokąd on leci. A tam czekała na niego śmierć, Ukraińcy, którzy go wypchali do komór gazowych.
By October 1942, about 3,000 people could be gassed here at one time. Beyond the chambers were the burial pits. Later, to hide the evidence, mechanical diggers were used to move the corpses to the so-called roasting area, where they were laid out on racks for cremation in the open air. Some 750,000 people were sent to Treblinka. About 70 would make it out alive. One survivor described Treblinka as a factory of horror whose sole product was bodies. By the winter of 1942, Commandant Stangle was processing up to 12,000 victims a day. He admitted later, "I got used to the convoys. It was hard to see them as individuals. I saw them as masses, as baggage or cargo. Every delivery was meticulously recorded."
Trudno uwierzyć, że w takim małym przestrzeni taką zbrodnię można było dokonać. Trudno. To, wie pan, nie mieści się w głowie. Ten rozmiar zbrodni jest ponad normalne myślenie.
By the spring of 1943, there were very few Jews left alive in the Warsaw Ghetto. Stangle's job was done. And his crime wasn't just killing. He had supervised the stealing of Jewish possessions on a staggering scale. As a reward, he was named Best Commandant in Poland and received the Iron Cross. But his loyalty was repaid with a one-way ticket to northern Italy to fight in the bloody battle with Italian and Yugoslav partisans. In his view, his superiors hoped he would be killed because he knew too much. Many of his former comrades died in the vicious fighting, but Stangle was to make it out alive. He survived to witness the defeat of Nazi Germany by the Allies. In the confusion of the last days of the war, Stangle made his way back to Austria. As a former SS officer, he was a marked man. He was soon picked up by the Americans and detained in their camp near Salzburg for the next 2.5 years. But they had no idea of his former role as a death camp commandant. In fact, in 1943, the Nazis had attempted to hide the gruesome evidence by dismantling all their extermination camps in Poland. The terrible reality of what the Nazis had done to their victims was finally revealed to a horrified world when the victorious Allied armies swept into Germany and Austria in 1945.
This is what the Germans did. Let there be no mistake about it, did deliberately and slowly to doctors, authors, lawyers, musicians, whom they've turned into animals behind the wire of their cage. This day at Belsen was the most horrible of my life.
When the concentration camp at Mauthausen was finally liberated by the Americans, Simon Wiesenthal was among the survivors.
In the day of liberation, I could not walk. But I wished to see the sun. I wished to see the American tank. And all four, I was come out from the block and look on the American flag. I feel that every star, this is a star of justice, and this is a star of friendship, and this is a star of culture. And the stripes, this is roads to freedom.
Incredibly, Wiesenthal learned that his wife had survived. They were finally reunited. For several years, both of them had thought the other had died. But his own experience of the camps left him with a determination never to forget what had happened to his people. And he had a phenomenal memory. On May the 25th, 1945, he wrote a report for the American War Crimes Investigators, listing 91 Nazi criminals. He didn't know then, but it was the start of his Nazi hunting career. He searched the displaced persons camps for witnesses who could testify against the Nazi war criminals. Fellow survivor Mannes Diamond saw Wiesenthal at work.
Ich habe Wiesenthal kennengelernt in 1146. War ich in Bindermichel und habe gesehen einen Mann, der steht und klebt Bilder auf eine große Holztafel. Und alles Bilder von SS und Gestapo und Militär und mit Unterschriften und so weiter. Und nebenan sehe ich, steht ein Kaffee auf dem Sessel, weil der Tisch war voll Papiere. Auf dem Sessel steht eine Tasse kalten Kaffee mit einem Sandwich mit Fliegen. Und ich habe den Feng observiert, wie die Arbeit in ganzen Kraft seines Lebens und so weiter.
But Wiesenthal was soon frustrated by the attitude of his American colleagues. They just didn't seem to care as much as he did about bringing the war criminals to justice.
I find some Americans, they say, oh, I recognize the problems. You have here Nazis and anti-Nazis, and we have Democrats and Republicans. So now I decided it's time to make our own center with 30 survivors, people like myself.
So with his colleagues, he set up what he called the Jewish Documentation Center in the Austrian city of Linz and began preparing evidence.
I was very, very careful that every accusation must be absolutely good funded, because I know the Nazis was against us with general accusations, but we cannot pay with the same currency.
Wiesenthal would spend hours leafing through documents. In 1948, he spotted that a certain SS officer, Franz Stangl, had been rewarded for special services to the Reich, Nazi code for a role in the extermination camps. He had no idea that the man he would hunt for 20 years had only recently been in the same city of Linz. What seems to have happened is that Stangle had remained undetected in an American detention camp until 1947, when his work at Schloss Hartheim on the Euthanasia program finally attracted the attention of the Austrian authorities. Unknown to Wiesenthal, they sent Stangle to prison in Linz to await trial. But extraordinarily, he was allowed to walk free and begin a life on the run. On the 30th of May 1948, Franz Stangl began a roundabout journey through Austria, then over the mountains into Italy, finally looking for help in Rome, headquarters of the Catholic Church. Along the way, he had met up again with Gustav Wagner, his former deputy from Sobibor extermination camp. They had been told to contact a Catholic bishop, Alois Udall, who made no secret of his Nazi sympathies. He'd set up a pastoral service for the German community in Rome, whilst discreetly helping former Nazis, like Stangle and Wagner, who were on the run.
Ja, der hat uns insofern geholfen, dass uns eine Bescheinigung gegeben hat, dass unsere Papiere bei ihm liegen. Nicht? Und wenn vor irgendwas ist, dass an sich, an ihm wenden sollte. Ne?
Within 2 weeks, Stangle was in the port of Genoa with a ticket for a ship leaving for Syria. A job in a textile factory had been arranged for him. The bishop had taken care of everything. Before long, Stangle was using his organizational skills at the Imperial Knitting Company in Damascus. After a year in Syria, he had saved enough money to send for his wife and daughters. But for a man on the run, he seems to have taken remarkably few precautions. His wife's neighbors could clearly see their destination, painted on her packing cases. She'd even told the Austrian authorities she was going to join her husband, who had escaped. For now, it seems Stangle had put his horrific past behind him, and events elsewhere were also working in his favor.
As Russia denounces Allied agreements with Germany, Berlin is reminded of the Cold War crisis of 1948 and 49, when the Reds completely sealed off the city from the rest of the world. The Allied airlift won that chapter. Now the Russians again interfere with traffic on the connecting highway between Berlin and the West.
In the early 1950s, the growing tension between Russia and America meant that hunting Nazi war criminals was no longer a priority for the Allies.
The Cold War assisted and helped the Nazis tremendously. They realized that through the difficulties between East and West, they could capitalize on the fact that they could escape or even remain in Germany or Austria without being punished, and therefore the difficulty for Simon Wiesenthal was that he had so much resistance to his work that I sometimes wonder that he did not despair.
In 1954, exhausted by the indifference of the Allies and short of money, Simon Wiesenthal closed down his office in Linz. His hunt for war criminals appeared to be over. But for the man on the top of his list, former camp commandant Franz Stangl, life was good in the early 1950s. After 3 years in Syria, he had made enough money to emigrate. Once again, the Stangls made their way to the Italian port of Genoa. As an experienced textile engineer, Stangl had found it easy to obtain a visa for Brazil, despite making no attempt to hide his name. The whole family was now looking forward to an exciting new life in South America. Stangl knew many of his ex-Nazi comrades had already made it over there. Among them was Gustav Wagner, his brutal deputy from Sobibor extermination camp. Once in Sao Paulo, the Stangls continued to use the family name, even registering with the Austrian consulate. But in his mind, Stangl had still not escaped the past. He had dismissed his Jewish victims as mere baggage, to be processed and dispatched. But one day in Brazil, traveling past a slaughterhouse for cattle, all the horror of random executions and mass killings came back to haunt him. For months, he was unable to eat meat. This would not be the last disturbing reminder of his past, but for now the Stangl family were doing well in Brazil. They set up house on the outskirts of Sao Paulo, in the district of São Bernardo do Campo. It was the Detroit of Brazil, home to several car factories, including Volkswagen's largest plant outside Germany. By the end of the 1950s, Stangl was working for Volkswagen and his wife for Mercedes-Benz. But it was not all good times for ex-Nazis hiding out in South America. the Austrian SS officer Adolf Eichmann had arranged the transportation of millions of Jews dispatched for extermination. His capture in Argentina on May the 11th, 1960, made headline news, but the Israeli government, aware that the operation was politically sensitive, wanted to play down their role. Instead, they allowed much of the credit and congratulations to go to Simon Wiesenthal, who had also been searching for Eichmann. It meant that during the trial, Wiesenthal was the center of attention. However, reliving the events of the Holocaust was taking its toll.
I was 3 months by the trial of Eichmann, and all was open. You know, daily and daily to hear and to saw the witnesses and to hear them. This was terrible for me. This was terrible for me also. Not only for me, but also for the others. I cannot be put in the gas chamber, and I cannot be put without food, you know. But essentially, I am living in that. But I found a distance, because without this distance, I could not live longer.
The international publicity from the Eichmann trial triggered a new wave of funding, which meant Wiesenthal could relaunch the Jewish Documentation Center, this time in Vienna. He was back in the hunt for war criminals. Straight away, he began looking for Commandant Franz Stangl. He was determined to bring him to trial.
Wiesenthal realized from the very beginning the importance of trials, because only in a trial in a court of law can you really expose the whole truth, the whole awfulness of what had happened in the Holocaust.
The first sign that the net was closing on Stangle came with the start of a war crimes trial in West Germany in 1964. In the dock were 10 guards who had worked for Stangle at the Treblinka extermination camp in Poland. These were men who had carried out their daily atrocities under his command. News of the trial must have made uncomfortable reading for their fugitive commandant, thousands of miles away in Brazil. In court, an album containing pictures of his camp at Treblinka, taken by Stangel's deputy Kurt Franz, was produced as evidence. It was entitled Schöne Zeiten, or Pleasant Days. Kurt Franz was sentenced to life imprisonment. West Germany had banned the death penalty in 1949. His trial was swiftly followed by the prosecution of another set of Stangel's former colleagues, this time from Sobibor extermination camp. Simon Wiesenthal actively used both trials to publicize his hunt for the missing Franz Stangl. His history of war crimes was now public knowledge in Austria. It was too much for the family of Stangel's wife, Theresa. In 1964, one of them revealed to Wiesenthal that Theresa and Franz were living somewhere in Brazil. They wouldn't say exactly where. But a breakthrough came a few days later, when an unexpected visitor made his way up the stairs towards Wiesenthal's office. An ex-Gestapo officer down on his luck. He had heard about the search for Commandant Stangle, and he had information to sell. His price, he said, was 1 cent for each of the Jews killed at Stangle's camp in Treblinka. Estimating the number at 700,000, Wiesenthal would have to pay $7,000 to find out where Stangle was now working. Though disgusted by the deal, Wiesenthal finally agreed, realizing he had no other way to get his man. Now he could really focus his hunt for Stangle on the suburbs of Sao Paulo, home to the Volkswagen factory. Using the codename Uncle Otto, Wiesenthal began to correspond with local contacts in Brazil. Their research soon identified Stangle's home address. The net was closing, but Wiesenthal had to be careful. Secretly, he prepared the evidence needed for Stangle's potential extradition, knowing that South America's community of ex-Nazis could help his man disappear at any time. In fact, Stangle had no idea he'd been found. He once said to his wife, "If that clever man Wiesenthal wanted to get me, he would have done it by now." At the end of 1966, Wiesenthal's long game began to pay off. In December, he traveled to Switzerland to meet a high-ranking Brazilian politician prepared to act as an anonymous go-between to push through the formal request for extradition. With his Brazilian fixer now on board, Wiesenthal prepared a detailed dossier on Stangle, working directly with the Austrian Minister of Justice. It was now February 1967, carnival time in Brazil. Unfortunately, everything stops for carnival. Wiesenthal had to get the dossier to his secret go-between before the end of the month. So it was a race against time. With just a day to spare, contact was finally made. On the evening of Tuesday, the 28th of February, Stangle and his daughter returned home from a drink after work. Within a few seconds, the trap was sprung by a team of plainclothes Brazilian police. Stangle was taken completely by surprise, just as Simon Wiesenthal had planned. To avoid any risk of escape or rescue, Stangle was secretly removed to the capital Brasilia, while the authorities publicly announced his arrest. Wiesenthal immediately sent press releases around the world to build up pressure for Stangle's deportation. He even persuaded Senator Robert Kennedy, former US Attorney General and future presidential candidate, to use his influence on the Brazilians. On the 8th of June 1967, Wiesenthal's campaign paid off. The Brazilian Supreme Court ruled unanimously that Franz Stangl should be extradited.
In the end, he was extradited to Germany. It took a huge effort, and it was entirely Wiesenthal's effort. No one else did as much as he did.
Within 2 weeks, Stangle was in Germany. There he would wait nearly 3 years before the authorities were ready to bring him to trial. Eventually, on May the 13th, 1970, Franz Stangl entered the courtroom. For Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal, this was to be West Germany's most significant criminal case of the century. It was the last stage in a journey that had begun 22 years before, when he had first come across Commandant Franz Stangl's name in lists of SS officers decorated for special services to the Reich and for psychological discomfort.
I was only on the first day of his trial. And he say, I feel so safe in Sao Paulo in Brazil. Nobody knows me. My friends say, and one day Wiesenthal will take you, and I smile. But it's not important. important was that during the trial, we have classes of school children was coming to hear the trial, and the next day they talk with their teachers. I saw companies of the Bundeswehr, of the German army. They was also talking about the problem. Because, you know, this is a living history.
Over the next 7 months, Stangle was forced to confront the reality of what he had done. On the 22nd of December 1970, Wiesenthal's faith in justice was rewarded. Commandant Franz Stangl was sentenced to life imprisonment for joint responsibility in the murder of approximately 900,000 men, women, and children. In prison, he finally admitted, "My guilt is that I am still here. I should have died. That was my guilt." 6 months later, Stangle did die of heart failure. For Wiesenthal, Stangle's arrest and deportation from Brazil was one of his greatest achievements, but he still had unfinished business in South America. Stangle's brutal colleague Gustav Wagner was still on the run. Before he died, Stangle had revealed that Wagner was hiding in Brazil. Once again, Wiesenthal played a waiting game. In the 1970s, Wagner was just one more Nazi war criminal on a list that included Auschwitz doctor Joseph Mengele.
In 10 years, and all the interviews that I had with some people for whom I am looking, I am telling about Mengele and Rauf and others, but not about Wagner.
But then, in 1978, he saw a Brazilian newspaper report of a celebration for Hitler's birthday. It was a chance to trick Wagner into the open. Wiesenthal made a public statement accusing one man in the photo of being the Nazi war criminal, Wagner. This triggered a search for the real Wagner, who had been living on this farm just outside Sao Paulo. With the police on his tail, Wagner handed himself in.
I was surprised that it was working. You know, always, you know, when a trick is working, everybody is surprised, because a trick is always 50-50.
Shlomo Schmeisner, one of the few survivors from Sobibor extermination camp, was then living in Brazil. He publicly identified Wagner, but the Supreme Court refused the request for Wagner's deportation on a legal technicality. And Wagner himself showed little remorse for his actions.
Verantwortlichkeit habe ich nicht viel gehabt. Nicht? Verantwortlich war der Stangle bis zu einem gewissen Grad. Nicht? Und dann war er wieder höher und dann wieder höher und wieder höher. Nicht? Bis oben. Nicht? Und dann mein Wirkungskreis war sehr, sehr klein.
In 1980, Wagner was found dead at his farm in Brazil. His lawyer claimed it was suicide.
But the fact that a man after 37 years after the crime, 10,000 miles from the place of the crime, was arrested and expect a trial is a warning for the murderers of tomorrow, maybe they are born today. That no time and no distance can be saved.
The case was now closed on two war criminals Wiesenthal had pursued for over 30 years. He had been driven by the memory of those who died in all the Nazi camps. He once declared, if he were to meet the victims in the afterlife, he wanted to be able to say, "I did not forget you."